welcome back to my channel. So our first two episodes of peat free gardening were all about the different types of peat free, and this episode is going to be about watering. And that might sound like I'm going to teach my granny to suck eggs, but there are different ways of watering, different types of composts, and it's really important to understand how water works within a plant in order to get that watering correct. So the most important thing to understand about watering a plant is that you need to make sure that the whole of the root ball that is in the pot, so this is talking about growing plants in containers or growing plants in sort of large pots in your garden. So when you water those pots, you have to make sure that all of the soil within the container has the same amount of water, and that it's not saturated, but it's all moist. So this is one of my chili plants that I grew at the beginning of this year. It's been grown from seed and it's been potted up into various size pots. And if you look at the root ball, you can see that all of the soil all of the way round is an equivalent colour. It's all dark, so therefore it's showing signs of being well hydrated. But what it isn't is it's not sopping, and that's really important. So at risk of making out that I'm a bad gardener, I'm going to show you a pot that's really overwatered. Now, the reason this is really overwatered is because it's an Ixalis Iron Cross, which I rescued from a local garden centre. It was on the sale rail, as it were, and it had been reduced to virtually nothing at all, purely and simply because it didn't look like it had been watered for about a week, and it was dry as a bone. But I've watered this, and I have overwatered it, but I know that it will drain through because this plant is struggling. But can you see there is water dripping off that? That is not good. A plant that is that wet all the time will not be able to take up the amount of water and the amount of nutrients it needs to do. And those little roots at the end, and actually there are some great examples here, will start to go brown and rot off. Now I've got this standing in a dry container, so it can't rot off because it's draining. But if that was like that permanently, that would be a problem. There are some types of peat-free compost, particularly the types that are very rich in wood or in wool or things like, you know, heavy recycled materials, that are likely to hold on to water a lot. And so therefore you need to be taking the plants out of the pot, or you need to be looking in the pot before you water. And this is going to sound like the most obvious thing in the world, and again, I'm not teaching grannies to suck eggs, but this is your best tool when it comes to checking for water. Put your finger right into the soil, a good 2 inches, and if it's dry down there, then that's great and it will need watering. But you will very often see, particularly with recycled waste type compost, that the top looks really dry, but when you put your finger in, it's actually really damp, if not overwatered. And one of the things that I very first learned when I started working in nurseries is that if you overwater a plant, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you underwater a plant, you can always add more. So if you're growing in pots and containers, you're better off making sure that the plants aren't sodden, but are getting enough. And if that means underwatering them and then watering them again, that's better than saturating them and the roots rotting. The other thing that happens if you overwater them and they sit and they are constantly damp is that effectively the compost becomes anaerobic, smells, is kind of eggy and sulphurous. Nothing can grow in that scenario, because there's no air to let the roots grow. Now again, at risk of showing myself to be a bad gardener, this is a meadowsweet that I say I've grown from seed. I haven't grown it from seed at all, it grew itself. I just picked it out of a piece of earth and potted it on. But this is a meadowsweet that it's meadowsweet, okay, that's the first thing. Like, to kill it would be pretty impressive. But it hasn't been, it's ready to be potted up. It needs, and it hasn't been properly watered. And you can see, can you see? You can see how it's very pale here. And when you pick it out of the pot, you can hear how dry it is. But that's really easy to sort out, because all I need to do is water it a bit more. Whereas this one, I have to pray that the weather will behave long enough for it to drain. Now, of course, with this one, I could always take it inside, because it could be a house plant as well as an outdoor plant. But it's still the case in question. Overwatering is not good for your plants. So why am I telling you this? What has this got to do with growing in peat-free compost? Well, this is where it becomes interesting. Peat-free compost is not an alternative to peat-based compost. It's a completely different product. And as we discussed before, some are free draining and some hold on to their water really well. The best way of finding out which you have is by putting it into a ball, and if it sticks into a ball, just like anything that is clay, it will hold onto its water and its nutrients. If it falls through your fingertips and refuses to create a ball, then it's obviously more coir based and therefore will drain better. But with that in mind, there are watering techniques that work better for both those types of compost, and you need to make sure you are using the right techniques for the right compost. And I think that that's where quite a lot of people get quite confused. So what I do know about this meadowsweet is that it's potted into Silvergrow, and Silvergrow is a coir rich peat-free compost made by Melcourt. So it's very free draining. And the thing with free draining composts is when they get dry, what can happen is the water can just completely bypass the compost and end up just out on just like that. Can you see? That hasn't actually gone into the pot and the soil at all. That plant is still as damp as it was, as dry as it was. But the issue with seeing water drain through a pot is that traditionally that would mean that that plant was fully hydrated, and it just isn't. So the first thing you need is a tray with no holes in. The second thing you need to do is just water it again. So we've already watered it once, and now we've watered it again. In that second watering, hopefully that plant will take more of that water that we put into it actually up into the root ball and into the soil. If it doesn't, what it should do is, using its own capillary action, the plant should pull the water that's around it up into its root system, and that's actually how plants really water themselves. So that's probably a really good way of doing it. In fact, it's not probably a really good way, it's a really good way. And the easiest way to check whether or not your plant is taking up the water is literally just to pick up the pot, because as soon as it does start to pick up some water, it will begin to feel heavier. And then we're just going to pop some more in, and you can see that some of it is still going through to the bottom, but that capillary action will support that plant to take up that water, and that will mean that the plant will rehydrate itself. Now, what we also could have done is, if we had a whole variety of plants that were very dry, we could just put them all into this tray, water the tray so that they were about a quarter of the way so that the water was about a quarter of the way up the pots, and we could just let the plants get on with it themselves. That's because the best way of any plant watering itself is to water itself like it would if it was out in nature. And what we know about plants is the taller the plant, generally the deeper the roots. So yes, of course, annual things we need to water because they don't create massive root systems. But if you're watering things like shrubs that are in pots and containers, you actually want to encourage those roots to grow down into the pot, because that's the best way of growing a root system. You don't want them all to be around the surface. Now, of course, anything that's been grown in a heavier compost, so a wool-based or a wood-based compost, something that when you put it in a ball in your hand stays in that ball, is going to need far less watering, but an equal amount of looking after to make sure that it has got a good amount of water. The most important thing to remember is this: just because something looks like it's dry on the top doesn't mean it's dry around the roots. You have got to use your finger. But otherwise, my suggestion to everybody would be, in order to make sure that you are using two completely different watering regimes, that you keep your plants separately depending on what they are grown in, and that way you can organise yourself to water them in the right way. And personally, I've always found the most useful way of working out whether or not a plant is dry is to pick up the pot. If you can pick up the pot and it feels dry, you know that you need to do something about watering that plant. Whereas even if it looks like it's dry on the top, if you pick up that pot and it's still quite weighty, you know it doesn't need anything. That's a really, really useful way of working out who needs watering and how often. And of course, then we have summers like we've had this year, and everything needs watering an awful lot more than it would do at most other times of year. And I think it's also really important to remember that at this time of year we have to be thinking about slowing down on watering, and that means a whole heap of things. And it also means being really aware of what's been grown in what. Plants at this time of year will stop taking up as much water as they have done over summer. Then they might be still actively fruiting or flowering, but they're not actively growing above the ground at this time of year. And so their water needs change. And it's really important from now until late October that you slow down that watering and you do start to let them dry out a bit more than you would do during the summer. You want your plants over winter to be quite edging on the dry side, just because the law of you know who is that it's going to rain and your plants are going to get wet anyway. So it's really important at this time of year to really start slowing it down. Anything grown in a heavy compost, I would actually almost stop watering, and I would certainly not water just out of habit. But anything that's in a coir based and more free draining compost, I would continue to water, especially if you're still watering seedlings or small plants, because they are still actively growing, and they will do until the temperature starts to really drop, and more importantly until it starts to get cooler. So that was quite a lot. I hope it's helped, and I hope these are helping. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about soil conditioning and different types of compost to use within the soil and how we feed the soil. That's going to be kind of a mixture of peat-free information, but also quite a lot of no-dig information, but hopefully it will be really helpful for people who are struggling or finding peat-free a challenge. It is a challenge. It's not the same product at all as peat based compost, but it's perfectly okay and perfectly great to use. You just have to work out how. So hopefully these are helping, but I'll be back in the next week or so with the next episode. Thanks for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe. Apparently I'm meant to say that on YouTube. Who knew? See you all soon.